responsibility, I'm thinking about trees, and I'm thinking about what you were saying about the Upanishads and about reading the Upanishads and realizing that the translation is poetic, and what your 1972, Book of the Crab has that kind of like association to me of what you're describing about the Upanishads. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I'm, and I went back to the mysticisms that I studied in the 1950s the other day to take a look at them. Um, and what I walked away from Blavatsky and all those people was so simple. All you had to do was to make the decision that you were a servant of something larger than yourself. And every day you were obliged to redefine that larger thing and clarify it. Or every week, it was a continual process. So that's what I walked away from all that stuff with. What I abandoned was you have initiations. And your first initiation, you were A, and by the 10th initiation, you were a master. And so I looked at all that stuff and I thought, is that true of me? And I found out that I had little bits and pieces of every initiation in it. And thinking about it at all was confusing me. It wasn't clarifying a damn thing. And I had this giant flash in my head. Quit that shit and just make your own path. And that's what I did. And that's what Helen did. She was so relieved to hear this. And she engaged herself in it. So to go back, I think, I'm not sure how to do this. I'm rambling too much. Let me see if I can get more specific. Difference between responsibility and obligation. Are they first cousins? I know for myself, because I was so privileged, I felt an obligation to help others. I had been just endlessly helped. Even when my parents were pissed at me for refusing to be an industrialist, they still sent me $600 or $700 a month for 10 years till I got my professorship. And that was enough, so I didn't have to get a job and it didn't screw up my art. So I mean, that's the kind of thing you have to think about. I mean, I felt obligated to myself and to the field to be the best artist I could. And then I figured by the time the early 60s came along, I thought I have to regenerate the field. The field has to take on a different kind of subject matter. And then by the late 60s, Helen and I started to invent the subject matter we felt it had to take on. And by the time we got into the apology, we found out the subject matter was so serious it was changing us, let alone everybody else that we hoped for. And so on. So I think what are the components of responsibility? Do you have an idea of it? I'm trying to think of it, and I'm drawing too vague.
I think that responsibility is relational. So it implies an action that is devotional to something else.
That's true. Well, no, how true is it? Because the first responsibility is to live. And so that's to yourself.
Yeah. For me,
once that's taken care of, then what you said applies.
yeah, like, if I think, well, I'm responsible for this plant. I have it, I brought it here. I'm going to do what I can to keep it alive. And I'm responsible for this house, because it's mine and I agree to pass it on, care for it and pass it on in the world in in a way that's, reflects the joy I've had in having it. And I'm so it's always in relationship to, so I feel like that for me is an aspect of responsibility, is it's relational.
Well, okay, let's see what we can draw from that. What you're saying is that responsibility starts intimately.
Yeah,
You're living in the house, it's taking care of you, you're taking care of it. You're living in your family, you're taking care of your family, your family's taking care of you. Whoops, your family happens to be all life, then we have something. You see what I'm saying?
right, right. It's getting from the solipsistic, you're inside of an egg and you're responsible to all that's in the egg, into that idea that that egg is in direct relationship to everything around it, and all the systems that are also attached to it are in a dynamic, constantly changing evolution that requires our participation, obligation, responsibility.
Okay, so obligation and responsibility are like kissing cousins, right? They're like each other and they have differences and similarities. What's the difference between an obligation and a feeling of responsibility? I think they're very close. As a matter of fact, I find that if I feel obliged, my sense of responsibility for a thing is intensified. If I'm speaking personally, I thought you may find that to be true. Think a minute. If you feel obliged, does your sense of responsibility intensify?
Yeah. Okay.
I think before I could continue this, I'd have to go look it up. I'd have to find out who'd done thinking about responsibility. And I'd like to find out what other people think, because I'm running into a little dead-endedness here.
I'm gonna get my iPhone. I want to look up a couple things.
Oh, you got your little doohickey. You're gonna look it up.
Yeah,
Looks like a great day there.
it is gonna pour. But I also just put down the blinds. I'll put it back up.
Boy, it is a great day.
Yeah, it's supposed to pour. How about there? You're getting weather up there too.
Yep, it's raining, thank goodness.
Thank goodness. Okay, Merriam-Webster
Yes, sir.
says that obligation is some a definition of it is something such as a formal contract, a promise, or the demands of conscience or custom that obligates one to a course of action, like made an obligation to pay their children's college expenses.
But you see, they take responsibility for the kids' expenses.
And then it says something one is bound to do, duty or responsibility.
Yes. See, they're all they're woven together without their interrelationships made clear.
I'm gonna look up responsibility.
Uh-huh.
Bizarre. It says no match found. How's that possible? Okay. Responsible. Oh, there's some differences in some of the, if you're responsible, you're liable to be called to account as the primary cause, motive, or agent. being the cause or explanation.
Jesus.
To be able to answer for one's conduct and obligations. Being able to choose for oneself between right and wrong. Politically answerable, especially required to submit to the electorate if defeated by the legislature. Synonyms: calculable, dependable, good, reliable, safe, secure, solid, steady, sure, tried, tried and true, true, trustable, trustworthy, trusty.
That's pretty interesting. I would start with something like that with the kids.
And it's interesting to look at the thesaurus too, because for responsible, they have synonyms, but it doesn't include obligation. It includes the synonyms for responsible are accountable, amenable, answerable, liable. And related words are beholden, indebted, obligated, obliged. So in the thesaurus, they have obligated as a related word, but not a synonym.
But look at that nice list you gave. So
Yeah.
Say it again. It really resonates with me. What you just read out.
Okay, wait. I was going to obligation to do the same thing for thesaurus. Then I'll go back. The thesaurus for obligation has some interesting synonyms. For obligations, they're saying, first of all, they're saying that an obligation synonym is something one must do because of prior agreement. So a synonym would be burden, charge, commitment, duty, imperative, incumbency, need, office, responsibility. So interestingly enough, under obligation, they list responsibility as a synonym, but under responsibility, they list obligation as a related word. So under obligation as a related word, they have oath, pledge, promise, troth, vow, word, arrangement, pre-arrangement, setup, compact, contract, covenant, pact, trust, debt, payment, tribute, compulsion, constraint, restraint, must, requirement, coercion, duress, force, appointment, engagement, onus.
Know what's happening? We just went back to school. How interesting. You see, when you come up with a foundational question like that, like what am I responsible for? I mean, what is responsibility? You see how complex and interwoven it is, but it always goes back to something it always goes back to feeling obliged. No, the source of that would be where this 14th and 15th century nobility was noblesse oblige, right? And that's what the Medicis feel, and that's why they build Florence. Never mind, it makes a little profit, and so on. So I think you have to begin. I think it'd be interesting to begin there. Get them, because after all, what do I push you to do and what do I push me to do? Like, it's the same thing, to take ever expanding responsibility and to grow into the responsibilities you take. One of the nice things about taking something on that you feel responsible for, but you're not quite good enough, is you go through an educational thing to improve yourself. And that's what I think these kids should take. I use the term climbing the ladder of your own creativity. And so let's imagine one of those, the kid who I talked to about a new city. What's her name?
Emily.
Emily, yeah. So I mean, like, supposing we were to take Emily as a working example. She feels responsible for the city. I never would have given her what I gave her if I didn't feel that her sense of feeling of responsibility was deep, was authentic, and was something that would continue. Otherwise, I would be wasting my time giving that kind of insight. But I think this is true of her. At least that's my reading of her for a quick one. So let's begin with her. And you say, well, Emily, you feel responsible for the city. What does that mean to you? And you can say, well, it means to me that we need a safe water supply. What does that mean? Well, that means we got to purify the Great Lakes. That's what it means. Of course, once upon a time, we could all walk down to the lake and drink. I mean, you're thirsty. Oh, here's a birch bark, a little cup held together with pine pitch. Off you go. And so, got to think of like that somehow, where you want to take a responsibility for some big thing, and you find out all the things that all the creativity you have to apply to take the responsibility, and that's where growth happens. So I think that the kids might, well, you have 8 or 9, they're all bright, they're all quick, and they can teach each other and you and me if I'm part of it. First, that then their struggle to grow comes up to the surface, not their struggle to please people, not their struggle to get a good degree so they're going to be successful in life, but the struggle to grow. And that's the core, and that's where the power of being an artist is, and a writer too. So, and all people who create grow, because your new creation is better than your last one. Even if you're lying to yourself, which you find out later and get embarrassed by. So, interesting problems these kids bring up, because they have no idea what's going on in your head or in my head for that matter. And because they're too young to form the thought. So what my obligation with these kids is to help them form thought. To help them form thoughts, what I learned from all my years of teaching was you stand next to the kid and you create with them. If you create with them, you are automatically telling them you value what you're doing, and here's how you can continue. And you're interested because there you are creating. And because you are creating with them, you're teaching them the habit of continuous creativity. More than that, I don't know what to do. But you see, once you get there, then you say, how big is your sense? What are you responsible for? And then you say, hey, look around at the whole world. What's the biggest responsibility you can take? And then, is that big enough? And then, can you really take it? And so on. And so what are the avenues to it? And then you begin to discuss. All of a sudden, the impossible looks like, let's do it. Like, let's imagine we're going to take on the atmospheric common. And what are you going to do with this atmospheric comments. Well, I'm going to increase the oxygen content of the whole globe by one, so it goes back to 21% instead of 20%. And how are you going to do that? Well, we're going to put the lumber industry on notice. We're going to stop all coffee plantations. People are going to go have to synthesize it in a lab or something, because you're not going to cut down the rest of the rainforest to make coffee plantations and things of that sort. So you start to engage at much bigger issues than your little neighborhood. And that's what your Bending the River thing went and forced you to do.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, everything you get. Oh, I remember so clearly. You asked me what was the matter with it. I thought it was too gestural, and you agreed. And then the question, then that brings up the most interesting possible question, because most work begins with a gesture. Most work begins with indignation at something that you want to do something about. Well, then the move from gesture to material is the key thing. You move, for instance, your piece moves from gesture to material as you start to take up larger issues. Just like for me, the thing I did for the Mediterranean was really gestural. The thing I do with the Sensorium for the World Ocean is a critique of my gesturality and frustration with it of the Mediterranean.
Yeah, I found that it was interesting to read the dictionary synonyms for obligation, because it made me think about the work of Annie Sprinkle and marrying the earth, or marrying a brine shrimp. Those performances are vows, they're committed things. So it's operating on the dictionary definition of obligation,
Yep.
which I think is interesting and I wouldn't have thought of before. And I think that when I think about your meditation on the Great Lakes, I feel like there's also something of a vow. There's something earnest, like it's you're speaking it like it is because of your responsibility to do so.
That's
So you're doing it out of more a traditional sense of responsibility than obligation.
well,
But when I formed a country as a way to like resolve the problems of the inner Mountain West, that became an obligation, whereas you doing the talk is a responsibility. You were doing the talk because you have a responsibility to share what you know in a conference on art and the environment, and to support a dialogue about how big is here, which we wanted to bring into a conversation about art and the environment, but failed miserably to do so.
one of many.
One of many, but we tried. So
Exactly.
I would say that was more of a like responsibility with a obligation inside, and the obligation was you can join a country, which is kind of like marriage, being part of something.
Well, I'd like to say something to that. My doing the Great Lakes, you doing Rose. I think other people have done made similar kinds of notions in different places. I think that we've got a hold of something, that the world has organized itself inappropriately. The human race has organized the world itself to its own advantage, but it forgot that it had to design advantage back into that which it was taking advantage of.
Yeah.
And so all of our work is correctional at the moment. I mean, what else can we do? So So to go back to your kiddies, I think that this is a good beginning for them. I began with my class in storytelling back in '80 when I had the lead seminar in a similar way. Um, I simply proposed to all the kids that I looked at their work and I said it wasn't good enough. And it looked like their last teacher who wasn't a good artist, or it looked like the pictures from the magazines, because you wanted to be successful before you understood what you wanted to be good at, what you needed to be good at. So that your desire in school is to succeed at something as opposed to find wisdom. Originally, when the schools began in the monasteries in Europe, and you walked around talking to your preachers and you're wondering how this or that lived, that's where teaching began. It was intimate, and it was about taking responsibility. It was about learning about, like, unfortunately, that responsibility was a belief in a non-existent being, which then screwed everything up inside. But still, responsibility did take a role there. And it doesn't now in the schools. Not that I could see. So I think initiating a responsibility discourse in your class, getting each kid to figure out what they're most responsible for, posing that responsibility, that's too poor a definition and requires a new definition, and a new one and a new one. The kids will start to find their own way, and they will be guided in their own way toward environmental concerns. Because ultimately they have to understand that their survival is dependent on it. So's yours, so's mine. So I sort of feel my way into that. I feel awkward about what I'm saying so far. I don't feel like I've been precise enough.
I think it makes a lot of sense. What makes you feel awkward?
Don't know. I'll have to find out. Maybe I'll know next week. I don't always know why I say things.
Well, I think last week we started to talk about maybe me using some of my time here to talk about the responsibility we feel, you and I, to help students think about what's needed to make a city of the future.
That's true. And the first thing, look what we went to now, first principles. First principle is, if we want a student to feel responsible, what is this responsibility? I mean, what is responsibility? How does it look?
So we've come up with that responsibility is the first discourse on a new culture that needs to emerge.
That's right. And then you go back to Bateson, and I like his title, Steps to an Ecology of Mind.
Whose title is that?
Gregory Bateson. Is his principal book, the one that it needs reading. I'm going to tell you Gregory Bateson's story.
Okay.
Comes to pass, it's 1974 again. My buddy, Bob Levy. Levy was a cultural anthropologist, in his right, and he had invented psychological anthropology, a subtext, a branch of it. And he was one of Bateson's absolute favorite students. So he calls him up and he says, Gregory, come on down. I want you to see Newton and Helen's fish farm, because they're running in parallel to the thinking you're doing in the Steps to an Ecology of Mind. Bateson shows up. There's me and Helen and two assistants in the room. There's bated breath. The great Bateson has walked in. What will happen? Well, I'm going to tell you what happened. The great Bateson walked in. He turns his head to the left. He turns his head to the right. He walks around one tank. He walks around the other tank. He turns his head to the left. He turns his head to the right and walks out. It was his way of art criticism. He couldn't. That's my Bateson story. So he communicated very precisely what he felt, which was, this has nothing to do with me, and why did my student bring me to this place in the first place? And that meant that while Bateson believed in the steps to an ecology of mind, he himself was not an ecologist.
I'm going to get that book right away.
Okay, when you get the book, one thing to look up that's stunningly useful.
Okay.
Look up redundancy and look up how he uses, I don't know what you call it, the overproduction of nature. See how he uses the term redundancy.
Okay. Great talk today, Newton. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it is interesting. It pushed me in ways I didn't expect. I don't know who else began with responsibility. It's something Socrates would have done. You know, you need to go to the source, you don't take on the surface. The surface says you got to teach something. Then we got to teach art. Do you? No, I don't think you do. You have to teach wisdom. Well, where does wisdom come from? Well, that means wisdom comes from being unafraid to ask a foundational question that looks like it's coming from left field, but it isn't. It's the core. So that's what I think. That's my takeaway.
Thank you.
This was very useful for me. It pushed me around a bit. Very nice. Thank you myself.
Thank you. And I'll talk to you next Sunday.